At noon the sun did not ask permission. It simply fell, blunt and bright, across the red clay of the Recôncavo. Heat hung like a sheet between house and river, and the world seemed to shrink to the length of the road that led from the Senzala to the square. They had come out because the house wanted a theatre of domination, and the road provided an audience. Women with cloths over their heads, children pressed behind cart wheels, oxen slouching in the shade of a tamarind tree. The chapel bell had tolled once, slow and indifferent, as if warning the air that something shameful would pass beneath its shadow. Rosa walked barefoot in the dust, and every step was a sentence. Her shoulders bore a child like a bundle of linen. Clarice, thin as a ribbon, pale as new bread, sat astride Rosa's back with an arrogance taught by generations in soft chairs. A small parasol curved over Clarice's head to protect her from sun and from the work of understanding. Clarice's hands rested on Rosa's shoulders, as if they were the only things she had earned the right to touch. They commanded the procession to move forward in measured pace, a ritual of humiliation practiced so often it had a cadence. A slave walks, the child is displayed, the house asserts itself. The men of the house rode ahead on horses whose flanks were still slick from sweat. Behind, the field workers fell into a mutter like dried leaves. Miguel walked 2 paces back, his jaw set. Perpetua watched from the doorway of the Senzala, a coffee mug cooling in her hands. The Coronel Enrique Becerra Amaral sat high in his saddle, a figure carved from the same dry heat. He watched like a man who had practiced not looking at certain things. Rosa felt the child's weight in a way men and women who had never been made to bear another human knew only as rumor. This was not merely muscle and bone, it was the burden of a long-hidden truth folded under flesh, a lineage that had been kept out of papers and out of conversation. The secret had a crescent, pale and literal, tucked under the dip of her left clavicle, a small birthmark, the color of a moon more than a scar. Perpetua had traced it with the end of a gnarled finger and said not in anger but in the weary language of truth, "That mark is merchant and master both. Keep it close like a map." Rosa had kept it. It had lived under her skin like a lit coal. Clarice laughed, suddenly and sharp. "You walk like an ox, Rosa," she teased. The sound ricocheted off the whitewashed walls and seemed to gather more shame as it drifted through the street. The women by the well glanced away. Children, pretending not to hear, pressed their palms to their mouths. Only Miguel's eyes did not look away. He had seen many things, the old signs of trouble in a man's hand, the tremor behind laughter. He felt in his bones that an animal who carried secrets carried also a kind of weapon. The procession moved past the sugarcane, past the vendor with a tilted hat hawking plantain fritters, past the public wash where women scoured linens with rhythmic thwacks. The earth smelled of cut cane and hot sweat, of embers smouldering under the cooking pots. A wind lifted dust into little halos that clung to the hems of Clarice's dress, darkening it like mud. For those watching, the spectacle was clear. The house had the power to turn human beings into props. For Rosa, each step was a ledger entry in the account of a life stolen by silence. There were other things in the procession besides the spectacle. Padre Elias had been asked to walk at its head, to offer the gloss of sanctity over what the house pretended was discipline. He had refused a few days before, an action that had shocked the household and delighted the kitchen. He said he would attend Mass, but he would not bless cruelty. Still, the colonel had sent men to fetch him, and in the end Elias had come because the weight of a congregation's reliance often bent a man into places he did not wish to stand. He kept his cassock buttoned and his mouth quiet, and the chapel door framed him like a stage prop stripped of comfort. Perpetua watched the procession from the threshold and felt memories rise like smoke. She had been a young woman once, with more teeth and fewer aches, and she remembered the day Benedita had been sold. The market had smelled of sweat and coin and of animals. Children had clung to the skirts of their mothers, their small hands trying to compute commerce as a cosmic law. Benedita had gone with a trembling dignity. Her head turned once, and Perpetua had seen the pale crescent on her shoulder too, hidden by the hem of the shirt. The memory had taught Perpetua that marks were more than skin deep. They could be keys, or they could become chains. She had chosen then to hold stories for those who could not speak. "Keep near the wall," she said to those who would listen. not wanting to sound like one who prophesied. "The sun will be worst by the time they reach the square." Her voice was low, and Rosa heard it as if Perpetua had leaned over her shoulder. Rosa had not known Benedita. She had only learned her name in whispers. Perpetua's stories were a small cartography of loss and wisdom. There had been a time when Perpetua wrapped Rosa in a thin shawl and showed her the mark, teaching her to tuck it under her hand in cold weather and reveal it only when the moon was full and trust had been earned. "Your body remembers," Perpetua told her. "Never let other folks tell you what memory belongs to you." Memory was a thing to keep as much as a thing to give. On the road, Clarice kicked at a clod of earth and it flung open a small cloud that rained dust over Rosa's neck. The child's fingers dug into the shoulder she sat upon, leaving the ghost of an imprint. Clarice's eyes were clear and bright, with the arrogance of a girl whose world was promised to continue uninterrupted. She had been taught to name and to claim and to feel entitled to the world. Cruelty had been given to her as a kind of inheritance. The coronel had never acknowledged Clarice publicly as his daughter. This was the cruel joke that kept them both secure. But as she sat there, her presence seemed to insist on a truth the house was not ready to face. The townspeople lined the square, and they watched like a congregation. Some had come to the edge of the world of the house and stood with folded arms, their faces the map of small resistances. Others had been drawn by a curiosity that refused to be moral. Children clambered on low walls to get a better view. A dog lay in the shade and lifted its head as the procession passed. The square itself held a memory of many such rites. Punishments, weddings, the passage of men who thought they owned the earth. Its paving was warm underfoot, the stone polished by 1,000 feet. Rosa smelled bread and oranges, and the iron tang of the smithy. The sun at high noon made the air thin and metallic. Sweat trickled down the inside of her elbow, and the strap of a coarse sack rubbed a red path along her shoulder. She focused on breath because breath was a rhythm she could control when everything else was ordered for someone else. She concentrated on her feet, on the small bones of the heel, on the way the earth gave and took. Her thoughts traveled to small things, a patch of green where a bitter herb grew, the exact pattern of Perpetua's weave, the way Miguel would whistle softly to the oxen to calm them. "Stop!" Clarice called suddenly, and the word seemed too small for the command it carried. She pointed ahead at the square, and the servants ahead of them opened a path. The coronel sat impassive, but his lips twitched like a man trying to keep a joke inside his teeth. He watched Rosa with the calculating look of a man who kept score with other people's movements. The procession halted. A hush began like a curtain dropping. In that vacuum, small things made themselves known. The glint on a ring, the slight hitch in the priest's breathing, the way Miguel's hand closed around something invisible. Rosa lowered herself to a stoop to set Clarice down. The child's weight shifted and then slipped, and Rosa felt the small bones of the girl against her chest. For an instant, Clarice was at the level of Rosa's eyes, an exchange of breaths that carried more than the house could have planned for. Then, as if in response to some long-defied gravity, Rosa made a choice her body had been taught not to make. She drew a cloth from the bundle at her hip, the cloth with Perpetua's pattern, faded but precise, and she wrapped the child's ankles gently, as one would wrap a fragile root. It was an odd tenderness to witness, one that cut against the script of humiliation. People shifted. Someone laughed once, and the laugh sounded thin, like old rope. It was not a sudden revelation that made the change. It was a steadiness. Rosa had learned the language of endurance, and she had learned also the language of surprise. In the long way she had been kept small, she had cultivated a fierce patience. Patience that could hold a child and hold a truth at the same time. Patience that could wait until the road opened for what needed to be named. Miguel, close enough to see the crescent mark partially revealed by the angle of Rosa's shift, felt the old story fold open in a new place. He had known, for many years, of the colonel's appetite for certain women and the quiet results left behind, like litters of silence. He had seen the colonel's temper, seen the way he used the law and paper and men to make things appear respectable. But Miguel had also seen the colonel in a moment of rare solitude, and that sight had always stayed with him. A man who knew the shape of his own secret, but had never given it a name aloud. Padre Elias, who had come and whose obligation had pulled him like a tether, stood at the edge of the square. He watched with his hands folded, jaw clenched. It was not his habit to refuse the rites that made the village function. The chapel had survived by the care of men like him. Yet even he felt the oddness of an order that transformed children into instruments. He tightened his hand on his breviary, the way one grips a rope. Perpetua had told Rosa stories about the moon. "The crescent is the remnant of something bigger," she told her once near a smoky stove, lighting the words with the care of a woman who studies knots. "It holds what is missing. A crescent remembers the full circle." Her fingers traced the little moon under Rosa's collarbones, as if naming it aloud would change its weight. Rosa had taken the gesture in and stored it among the few tender things she allowed herself to own. On the square, the silence grew thick enough to be a thing people could touch. Clarice, seeing the faces, pulled her parasol more tightly, as if she could make herself private beneath a cloth. The coronel's horse stamped and clucked. A few of the older men in the crowd exchanged looks, eyes that could read the hint of a wrong that might bring about right. There were, in that instant, possibilities that hung like fruit on a low branch. The possibility that Rosa would finish the script and keep her head down. The possibility that she would break it with a single word. It was the way the wind lifts something off the ground and holds it. Only choice could decide where it would land. Before anything decisive could occur, life supplied the small inevitable interruptions that both disturb and prepare a moment. A child somewhere to the left began to cry, a high, petulant sound that brushed across the square and left the air raw. Someone shifted, coughing, in a way that brought a faint ripple of sound. The coronel adjusted his hat as if to look dignified, but the action only exposed a bead of sweat that ran down his temple and slid into the sun-darkened leather of his collar. He did not look at Rosa. He looked over her head, practical as a man looking at a ledger. Yet the ledger was a thin thing in the face of flesh. Rosa could have stood silent. The crowd expected silence. The house expected the silence they taught. She could have been a model of endurance. Indeed, that is what many expected of those who had been put into this world as property and creatures of service. But Rosa had been honed by memory, and by a stubbornness Perpetua had called a woman's due. Memories do strange work. They hold conversations with people who are gone and provide counsel like a friend. Rosa's memory had offered her the image of her mother, Inacia, washing clothes along the bank of the river, humming a song whose words had been bitter as cassava and sweet as sugar. Inacia's hands had been clever. She had known when to mend and when to let a seam keep its hole. She had told Rosa once in the hush before dawn that names could be weapons. Rosa found her voice as if it were a tool she had been taught to handle by touch rather than by speech. Her first words fell small into the sun-heated air. They were not a shout. They were not a plea. They were a naming. "My name is Rosa," she said, and the sound of it made a little clapping of dust in the square. The crowd listened because names have a habit of making ears honest. Clarice tittered, embarrassed more than affronted. "You speak now," she murmured to someone near her, an insolent whisper that did not understand the weight of what name can do. Miguel's shoulders moved in something like a nod. Even the coronel's mouth twitched as if trying to form a retort. Padre Elias inhaled through his teeth. Rosa's next movement was deliberate. She lifted her chin, and the crescent at her throat caught the sun, a smudge of pale light that was small but emphatic. It was then that Clarice's laughter faltered. Her own skin answered with a heat that was different from the sun. The child's hand slid to the back of her neck, where for a heartbeat she felt the ghost of a mirror she had never looked into. The mark was not only a sign upon Rosa, it was a sign that belonged to another family member. Clarice's fingers found a small scar on her own inner arm by accident. Her hand stilled, and the air between them caught like a net. There is a certain strain of silence that follows recognition, a sound that is all eyes and held breath. It fell across the square. People who had come to be entertained found the entertainment slipping into something heavier. A few walked closer, compelled by a curiosity that would later make them tell the story in kitchens and barber shops. Others turned away as if bearing witness was more than they could do. The coronel, who had rehearsed many faces and controlled many small cruelties, felt his composure begin to fray in a way that practice could not staunch. He raised his hand as if to say, "This is not the time," then lowered it. He had relied on silence for years, the silence he purchased with rights and coins, But silence had a cost. It requires a perpetual payment of small violences. Each payment had been made in gestures like the one he now watched. A child paraded, a woman kept small. The public told that certain dominions were natural. Rosa did not accuse with the heat of a woman who wishes someone harm. She spoke in the calm of the one who has long catalogued the facts. "That mark," she said, turning so that Moore could see the pale crescent at her collarbone, the curve like a small moon caught in skin. "It is the same one that—" Her voice stopped. Not because it wanted to, but because the sight of Clarice's hand trembling matched the sight of something else. A mark at the coronal's temple, hidden under the dust and the lines of age. A similar curve that had been mapped by time into a pale crescent. For a second, time did something like gather itself. Men who had never been moved by the poor seemed suddenly to measure the weight of their own belongings. Women who had prepared for the house's displays of power sensed that the performance had become a reckoning. The parishioners exchanged looks that were halves of conversations. Perpetua's mug fell from her hand and cracked on the doorstep, sound falling like a final note. Padre Elias stepped forward then, not because he wished to be spectacle, but because a man in a collar must sometimes meet the moral wind. He said nothing at first. His hands were folded in front of him as if containing the pages of a law. Then his voice came, a low, unadorned thing. "We do not parade suffering for sport," he said. The words were not a sermon. They were an observation that landed like a stone in a pond. The ripples reached the colonel first. The coronel's face changed. Anger rose like a tide in his mouth, then ebbed as if something in the square had removed his tongue's permission to speak. For a moment he looked very old, the skin around his eyes thinning like paper. He had expected, perhaps, to be met with deference. Instead, he was met with a truth he had kept under the same dust as his deeds, the small crescent of evidence that could be shown to many and would not lie down. Clarice's breath came ragged. She had been taught cruelty as a costume. She had not been taught the script that follows, when someone names a truth that undermines an inheritance. Her hand moved to her neck with the erratic motion of someone trying to hide from a mirror. "It's not—" she began. Then her voice failed. She looked to the coronel for rescue and found, for the first time in her life, that he had nothing to offer her but an impossible, fumbling refuge. Rosa's voice was calmer than the temperature of the air demanded. "That crescent is not for sale," she said. "It never was." The words were simple, and they landed like a door closing slowly on the idea of property. She did not wield revenge as a weapon. She offered instead naming as a remedy. Naming in that square had the weight of law and also of mercy. There was a pause then that was more a gathering than a ceasing. The village held its breath as if waiting for the sun to move and show which shade would now be inhabited. In that silence, several small things occurred. People shifted. Some took a step forward, others retreated. Miguel wiped his palms on his trousers in a way that suggested prayer or perhaps just the need to reground himself. The coronel looked at Rosa as if trying to read a document with blurred ink. He had a life of defenses ready, and for a moment they were all edged and sharp. He could deny, he could buy silence in many currencies. But the square had become an instrument he could not simply purchase. His power had always been social and physical, and written on deeds. Yet now the social had turned against him because a mark, a crescent, had been made visible. Padre Elias closed his breviary, the book snapping like a soft clap. He had the sound of someone choosing beside God. "Speak plainly," he said. And in those two words he summoned legal and moral audiences at once, neighbors who held opinions, men who had been taught to accept orders, women whose lives were arranged by others. The priest's stance broke something like a spell. He had refused to bless the cruelty, and in refusing he had offered a small but crucial permission, that truth might be spoken. Rosa felt the space widen under her feet. The weight of Clarice's body was now a counterweight to decades of silence. What she held was not merely a child, but a story anchored by a mark. She turned her face to the people she had known all her life, the washerwomen whose hands now paused mid-motion, the old men sitting at the cafe whose conversations never strayed from politics and weather. There was a look that passed among many, recognition that the world could shift with a single naming. The coronel's mouth opened as if to speak. For a man who had never been asked to confess, The very idea of speech toward humility was foreign. He had commanded many things: fields, men, contracts, marriages, but he had not had to stand and be unmade in public. At the edge of the square, Perpetua's shoulders sank like a woman who had borne a cold for too long. Her eyes were bright with a different kind of light, the light of someone who had known what telling would do to a family and had decided that some debts must be paid. "It is time," she murmured, and in the scattered way her words travelled, who could say whether she spoke to the town or to the dead? A hush settled, not so much of fear as of attention. The moment stretched taut like a string that might snap, or might give a sound itself. Rosa felt that tautness in her chest, felt the beat of her heart, steady into a measure she had been keeping for years. For the first time since she had been a child, she understood that a body could be used as a map to expose a lie. She had come to the square carrying a child as the house ordered her to, but she would not remain under that order. Just as all the threads seemed about to converge, the coronel's mouth opening, Clarice's face paling, Padre Elias stepping fully into light, there came a small commotion at the edge of the crowd. A cartwheel lodged on a stone, and someone shouted. A dog, startled, barked. The sound was a gust that scattered the collected breaths and postponed the decision for the briefest moment. Miguel closed his hand around Rosa's elbow, in a grip that was neither rough nor possessive, but the kind of hold that keeps a friend from sinking under a wave. He leaned close so that only she could hear him. "When you speak," he whispered, voice gravelled by years of watching injustice, "say the truth as it is. They will try to turn the telling into spectacle. Do not make it that for them." Rosa smiled with the curve of lips that had learned to ration joy. "I will say what is true," she answered, and the words were a promise and a tool and a statement all at once. She felt it then. Naming would not be enough by itself. Names exposed but did not unmake the machinery of power. They could be the beginning of something, perhaps the hinge on which a door might open. In the square, people rearranged their positions as if preparing for a performance. The coronel rubbed his palms on his thighs and seemed to make a decision. His voice came out first, hoarse and not entirely sure of its cadence. "Rosa," he said, and his tone was meant to be correcting, paternal, "you will not speak against me in public." The words were both an order and a plea. They carried the house's grammar of obedience. But the grammar was failing. The square had learned a different language in the past hour. Padre Elias had moved to stand in the line of sight between the coronel and the crowd, and his middle-aged face looked like one who had been made to see too many things at once. "The truth must be spoken," the priest said simply, "not to shame for sport, but to restore what is broken." Rosa reached slowly for Clarice's hands and set them on her knees as if the child were a guest at a table rather than a prop in a parade. She inhaled and felt the air taste like the river after rain. "I will speak," she said, "but not for vengeance. For the children who will come after. For the names that were sold like iron and rope. For those who were never given papers." Her voice, low and steady, wrapped around the square the way smoke wraps a house. The coronel's jaw worked. He had at his disposal men and contracts, and the leverage of a name that meant something in those parts. He had believed silence to be the best ally. Now he faced a woman who owned the sound of her own name, and a priest who would not bless cruelty. The social ledger was unbalanced. Around them, faces sharpened. Some leaned forward as if a narrative might change their immediate fate. Others turned and began to speak into the small circles their lives formed, relaying what they heard like a cat recalls a movement. The square, in that noon heat, became an instrument of moral arithmetic. Rosa felt Perpetua's eyes on her from the doorway, and a memory of a small room, a thin blanket, and the low hum of a woman who had hidden bread and truth alike in the same place rose up. She felt the presence of her mother, Inacia, as if the woman's hands were still near the river's edge, returning lost garments to the water, naming each one as if it were a child. The memory of those hands steadied Rosa. She straightened, and her voice found a register that made the square fall quiet again. "There is a mark," she said. "It is not only on my skin." Her words moved like a tide, and they reached the coronel first, and then Clarice. "That crescent was in my mother's family. It is mine by birth. It is not an ornament you can choose to keep or discard." Clarice's cheeks drained color. Her parasol trembled like a leaf. She had been taught cruelty because the house had taught her that cruelty kept things in order. That order, for a woman like Clarice, had always been a warm room and table and the imagined future of a life without want. The sudden possibility that her future might be bound to the same secret that Rosa bore made her small in the way a person shrinks when a story they were told about themselves is revealed as false. At the back of the crowd, an old woman who had been present the day Benedita had been sold let out a small sound, an intake that might have been a prayer or a curse. She remembered the market, the way people wrapped children in shawls and handed them over like bundles. She remembered a crescent too. Many remembered small things and had held them like treasures for lack of a better use. There was for a moment a fragile civility. The coronel cleared his throat. The priest closed his book and the crowd waited. The day teetered. Whatever followed would be a hinge that could open toward rupture or toward something else. People felt it. They watched the coronel for the sign his body would give: anger, confession, denial. They watched him like sailors watch a sky before a storm. A wind came down the road then, and it felt like a small mercy because it moved the air and carried dust into new patterns. It also moved the flags on the porch, the rags tied to the fence, and gave the square a sound that was not human. For a second, the world seemed to hush and set itself like a frame for the thing that would be placed inside. Truth. Rosa unclasped the cloth that bound Clarice's ankles and set the child on the ground by degrees, like someone lowering a lamp so as not to break it. Clarice's feet met the stone, and she stood there, suddenly a child who had been taught to sit inside the meanings dictated by others. She looked small and frightened, and the parasol drooped. "You've been told a story about ownership," Rosa said, and her voice cut through the noon like a blade softened by use. "A story that says some of us are things, but I am not a thing. I am a woman who remembers her mother, and my mother's blood is not yours to name." The square breathed as if it had been waiting for the exhale. People shifted. Some hands went to mouths. The coronel's expression went through 1,000 decimal parts: disbelief, then rage, then a sickly awareness that the ledger had been exposed. He had cultivated a way of life that depended on the coercion of silence. That silence now had a crack running its length. It was then as if the weather of the world had decided to cast its lot with the truth that Padre Elias stepped fully forward. The priest's face was grave. He did not raise his voice to command. Instead, he said it plainly. "In this town, the truth must be named. Let the law witness if you insist upon law. Let the people witness if you insist upon the people." A murmur went through the town like the first notes of a song people remembered from childhood. The idea of witnesses had power in that place. For men who dealt in deeds, witnesses were a currency that could unlock papers. For women who had nothing but the weight of their bodies to show, witnesses could be a protection against erasure. The coronel's fingers tightened on his bridle. The heat of the sun seemed to make his temper more combustible, but there were limits even to what a man of his position could do in the face of a square full of eyes and a priest who refused collusion. He had for many years bought silence. He had bought it with goods, promises, threats. But the square was now supplied with a new commodity: attention. People attended to the truth when they could not afford to attend to the pain of others no longer. Rosa felt the moment arriving, like the arrival of rain after a long drought. She tasted it on her tongue like iron and hope. Her hand found a small rock and turned it in her palm, feeling its edges as if the physical could steady what the social could not. Behind her, Perpetua murmured a blessing that was half prayer and half strategy, words made not only to God, but to the human beings who would have to carry the consequences of whatever came next. "Speak," Miguel said, and his voice was neither urgent nor commanding. It was the voice of an ally who knew when to push and when to hold. He had stood beside Rosa through things that had taught him the weight of long endurance. For him, the moment was not only about the correction of an injustice, but about the possibility of building something new. Rosa lifted her chin. The square seemed to lean closer, as if the houses around it had ears. She had a script that was short and true, a thing Perpetua had taught her. Tell the facts plainly. Do not embellish. Let the world do the rest. She had been trained in humility as a survival technique. Now she trained humility into a weapon. She opened her mouth, and just as the first syllable shaped itself into sound, a shout came from the back of the crowd. Someone calling the name of a child lost in the heat, and the sound scattered the neat lines of attention like a flock disturbed from a tree. The square split its gaze for a second, and that second felt like an animal's small window to escape or to attack. Rosa paused, the sound of her breath loud in her ears. The moment held like a breath before a plunge. Everything was poised on a knife edge. The coronel's face, the priest's hands, Clarice's trembling, Miguel's steadying grip, Perpetua at the doorway, with her mug now in pieces. The sun watched all of them with a kind of impartial cruelty. Rosa could finish the sentence she had begun, or she could step back into the script the town expected of her. She felt the moon mark under her skin, as if it were a tiny sun of its own, bright and inevitable. In the pause, 1,000 small futures crowded the square. One imagined the coronel denying everything and forcing people back into places of silence. Another imagined the priest writing a paper and binding a man to a name in a way that made the land safe for others. A kinder future imagined the house rearranging itself to allow those who had been small to speak and build and plant. Rosa remembered Perpetua's hands, Ignatia's hum, Benedita's last look at the market. She felt the shape of the world if truth was named and recognized. She felt also the old algebra of power that would not disappear simply because a crescent mark had been revealed. She inhaled again, felt Miguel's fingers on her elbow, and let the name she had almost spoken fall into the heart of noon. The square waited, balanced like an instrument about to be played, and the next sound would either be a note that began a new song or a silence that would return everything to its accustomed chords. Rosa let the name fall into the square like a stone. It was simple, not a shout. His name is Henrique Becerra Amaral. The sound landed and rolled, slow and heavy, across the warm paving. For an instant, nothing else existed but that syllable and the thin, bright air. A woman nearby gasped. A child behind a wall began to cry again, smaller this time, as if the wind had waked something in the throat. Clarice's parasol slipped from her fingers and brushed the stones. The little ribbon that tied it to its handle whispered. The coronel's face went through a shift that was almost physical, like a mask loosened by heat. He set his jaw as if to form 100 cold denials, but his mouth opened and closed and did not produce the armor he might have expected. Padre Elias stood straighter, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. He had summoned a congregation once, but he had not called them to unmask a lineage. Yet the priest knew the shape of confession when it approached. There was a gravity that pulled people to an edge where they had to choose to look. He caught the coronel's eye and said nothing. Sometimes silence from a man in a collar held more pressure than any rebuke. Clarice's hands had found her throat by accident. There, under the soft skin, she found a small rise, a crescent faint as moonlight, a remnant she had not paid attention to until the moment someone named its twin. She blinked. Then her knees folded, and she sank down against the wall as if the world had become something she was not prepared to wear. Her face, which had been pale from the sun, went almost colorless. She reached for the coronel as if for a parent and discovered, with the shocking clarity of a child, that the parent had no role that could save her now. "There are witnesses," Miguel said quietly, but the words bore the weight of a trumpet. They reminded people that truth did not need to be invented. It was already there, embedded in marks and moments. Miguel's voice had the authority of a man who had watched, who had seen patterns of appetite and omission, and the small gestures that become proof. Perpetua moved then, as if the long slope of her life had taught her how to place one foot before the other when the world shifted. She came down from the doorway with a deliberate shuffle, the cracked mug held by the handle as if it were a lit torch. She stepped into the square and placed the broken cup on the stones, where it made a sound like a conclusion. She did not shout, she did not demand. She only lifted her chin and let the years in her face explain the rest. "It has been a long list," she said, and her voice carried. "Names and small berths washed under bedsheets. I saw Benedita leave the market with a bag on one arm and the crescent half hidden. I saw other women whose mouths were sealed with bread and promises. We watched and we kept because what else could we do? But we watched close enough to hold a truth when it came." Perpetua's hands moved as if she were counting invisible coins. 1, 2, the number of secrets held for 100 years. The coronel's horse fidgeted and stamped. The man on its back felt like a child losing his script. He coughed, an attempt at composure, and his gloved hand tightened against the bridle until the leather creaked. "This is slander," he managed finally. The word was clipped and brittle. He had spent a life shaping such words into fences. He believed language could fence in accusation as easily as paper could fence in land. Rosa did not answer the coronel's claim with shrillness. She answered with particulars, and particulars make a certain kind of law. "My mother's name was Inacia," she said. "She washed at the river, she hummed the yellow song, and she sewed little hems into our clothes so they would not fall apart in the rain. I remember her hands. I remember the night she pressed a cloth to my chest and showed me this moon. She laid a palm delicately on the crescent at her clavicle, as if to show its existence did not depend on anyone's consent. I have carried that moon more than your orders." The coronel's lips thinned. Denial trembled in him like a hand that has not learned a new tool. "You have no proof," he said, but the square answered differently. The crowd had seen Clarice's face, the way the child's fingers had found her own neck, the way the two crescents, a pale arc at Rosa's throat and a faint mirroring elsewhere, caught the sun. Proof in that place was not only ink and seal, it was the witness of many small eyes, the record of memory and touch that paper sometimes could not hold, but that people nevertheless recognized. Padre Elias opened his mouth then, not to sermonize, but to offer an ordaining of witness. "If this is to be settled here, let it be settled in light and with writing," he said. "I will request the presence of the town's notary. If the colonel has courage, let him speak in the sight of witnesses." His voice did not tremble. It carried the authority of a man who had stood at altars and had learned the weight of public promises. The coronel looked at the priest as if the man had offered him a bridge back to aristocratic dignity, a safe passage. His eyes flickered to the notary's bench at the end of the square, where an official who had studied the law in town sat beneath a fluttering handkerchief. There was a rustle among the bystanders, men who made their living on odd jobs, a seamstress with ink on her fingers, a barber who had cut many hairlines. People stepped forward, the crowd forming a rough ring of attention that came from habit and from the hunger for change that had been fed little by little. For a long moment the coronel was silent, as if choosing whether to fight in the open or to close his fist and buy another kind of quiet. He glanced back to the house as if to measure what might be lost. Power, reputation, a script that had been profitable. Then, in a voice that had been taught to command, he said, "If witnesses are what you require, let them stand. I will answer in the light." Under his words there was the faintest sound of shuffling. The house's instruments of power were being rearranged. Padre Elias called for paper and ink. A man sent to fetch the notary returned with a satchel and a small ledger, the leather worn to a greasy sheen by many hands. The priest walked to the coronel and fixed him with a look that had the gravity of someone who had seen men change when confronted with their own reflections. "Speak the truth where all can hear," he said. What followed was not neat. The coronel began in the old way, evasions, half-phrases meant to disguise gestures of irritation, but the square had become an environment in which half-answers ceased to suffice. The crowd pressed with the quiet pressure of people who had been waiting a lifetime for a slight shifting of the world's weight. A woman who had been present when Benedita was sold stepped forward and said something no one had expected. She described a necklace with beads and a pale moon hidden under the hem of a shirt. Others joined with fragments, an overheard whisper, a shifted hand, a farewell to a child at a market. The stories were small, mundane things that together constructed an architecture of truth. Faced with this architecture, the coronel's defenses began to crumble. Perhaps he had believed he could purchase silence forever, with land and rum and threats. Perhaps he had simply grown tired. Whatever his inner calculus, the man who had ordered parades of humiliation found himself answering to the market of human witness. He swallowed and then admitted, in a voice that lacked the old certainty, that he had, indeed, relationships that had not been acknowledged. The words were not the same as contrition, but admission was a doorway. "Henrique," Clarice said then, and this time her voice carried something like pleading folded with fear. "What does this mean?" She looked at him not as a daughter who had known tenderness, but as a child suddenly asking how the map of her life had been drawn without her knowledge. There was so much she did not have language for. Privilege mingled with pain, a childhood taught by hands that had not known a truth. He could not meet her eyes. He saw his reflection in the pond of the square, and saw a man who had been a keeper of silence for many years. There had been a time when the silence had been easy. Now the silence was a visible thing, perforated by name and mark. He took a breath and said slowly, "Yes." The single syllable landed like a stone dropped into the center of someone's cup of tea. It cooled everything. At the pronouncement of his own admission, something shifted that had nothing to do with penal codes, and much to do with the town's moral accounting. The coroner's voice had given the square a new arrangement. The man in charge had named his omission. He had, by default if not by desire, placed himself inside a story with consequences. Padre Elias leaned forward, and with a small deliberate gesture asked for witnesses to give their names aloud. People spoke then. Miguel, who recounted small patterns and the look of a man in private. Perpetua, who told the tale of Benedita's leaving. A seamstress who had mended shirts and found a folded cloth of evidence. The notary made notes, stamping the ledger with the kind of small official acts that in that place had teeth. There was no spectacular courtroom, no dramatic legal battle. There was instead the simple matter of names given and received, of ink and witness forming a social ledger. The coroner's confession was not a tidy absolution. It was a public acknowledgement that made his once protected posture awkward. He was confronted not with a guillotine, but with witness and the priest's steady book. There was, in the end, a slow, practical conversation, how to undo what silence had permitted. Padre Elias, who had a habit of trying to repair practical wrongs as well as name them, suggested something that would be both symbolic and useful, alforrias, humane acts that would free those the coroner claimed. This must be done in the sight of neighbors, the priest said, and the notary, with hands that knew the way paper could change fate, prepared a small stack of documents. Let this be done where all can see, and let there be witnesses to the act of freedom. It was an impossible breath of hope for some, and an unthinkable loss for others. The coroner's eyes flashed even then with old instincts. He was reluctant to let go of the structures that had benefited him, but being placed in the light can alter more than conscience. It intersects with the practical realities of a man whose name had been tied into the ledger of his estate. He had to choose. Preserve a brittle pride or concede to an unfolding truth that might cost him status, but also might, in the eyes of some, bestow a kind of moral closure. When finally he took up the pen, the movement trembled. Ink bled into the grain of the paper, as if to say that even the smallest strokes have weight. Padre Elias read the clause aloud in a voice that made it clear this was not theatre. By his own declaration, Enrique Becerra Amaral renounced property claims over those named, and with the notary's witness, the instrument of manumission was inscribed. It was a public and legal sort of thing, made solemn by the priest's presence and the notary's ledger. The writing did not erase years of injury, but it changed the present with a stroke. The crowd held itself in a way that resembled prayer. Some cried quietly behind cupped hands. Others let out sounds they would later describe as a laughter that was part relief and part release. Miguel's shoulders slumped, as if a load moved from his back into the air. Perpetua dropped to her knees briefly on the dusty ground and covered her face with both palms, not in mourning but in thanksgiving. Clarice hunched forward, the weight of privilege she had known burning into something she could not yet name. Rosa watched all of this with an expression that betrayed neither triumph nor forgiveness, as a theatrical flourish. She had not come to the square to stage revenge. She had come to claim a name and to offer the possibility of a new arrangement. When the notary handed out the papers, and he and Padre Elias and a couple of neighbors signed as witnesses, the words on the page were small, but real. A list of names, an action taken, a date noted. Men and women who had been called property all their lives were read into legal personhood in a few crisp sentences. What happened next belonged to the soft, practical details of people who must turn ceremony into living life, arrangements for transport, for the distribution of belongings, for the needs of families who had slept for years in the same hut under duress. There were exchanges of clothing and cups and small things that had been hoarded for a future they had never expected. People hugged in the square as if they had entered an unfamiliar season. Clarice, now publicly unmoored, rose slowly from the wall where she had been crouched and walked toward Rosa. Her face was wet with tears that surprised her with their salt. "Forgive me," she said, in a voice that broke under the weight of a child learning remorse. There was nothing theatrical in it. It was the quietness of admission. Rosa's hands were still. She reached out and took Clarice's fingers with a gentleness that surprised them both. It was a gesture that turned possibility into practice. The mistress and the woman who had carried her touched in a way that would later be written about as a beginning rather than an end. "Stand," Miguel said softly to Clarice, and his tone held no accusation. He knew that forgiveness in that hour would not be a single act, but a process. Clarice, who had been the visible image of household entitlement, began to unlearn the curves of habit that had made her cruel. She stayed in the square and watched as people gathered plans for what came next. She did not run back to the house to reclaim the comforts she had known. Instead, she listened to those who had once served her, and in listening she began to learn a different kind of language. Rosa did not use her naming as a cudgel. She had from the first spoken of future children and of memory. "We must build a place where children can learn their letters and the worth of their names," she told the crowd, voice steady. "We must plant fields that feed us and teach the next generation what our hands can do." The idea was practical and had authority because many had already been thinking the same thing in quiet ways. It was not an instant solution, but a seed. Over the following days, the scene at the square rippled into the fabric of life. The notary's ledger pages were copied and filed. Agreements were reached for small parcels of land at the edge of the estate. The coroner, perhaps to salve his conscience or to avoid future legal entanglements, agreed to set aside a tract where those he freed could settle. It was not a grand grant of acres that would make people rich. It was a modest, workable piece of land, a valley that ran toward a stream and sheltered in its curve the promise of soil that would be tended by hands freed to tend. People called it, in a language that became hopeful and simple, liberdade do engenho. The exodus from the house was not a cinematic flight, but an organized migration. Those who had worked in the fields gathered tools, put into sacks the few crockery pieces and treasured garments they had managed to keep hidden, and walked in a line that was both a retreat and an arrival. Rosa led the small column with Miguel at her side. Perpetua carried a satchel of seeds and a sack of medicinal roots, as if these were the things most necessary to life. Clarice followed at a distance, sometimes stepping close to hand over a folded cloth or to help carry a pot, learning through labor what she had been spared and what it meant to share a burden rather than to impose one. The valley that became Liberdade do Engenho held the smell of wet earth and the hum of insects. Its slope caught morning light in a way that made seedlings look like green promises. People set up lean-tos and small huts, piles of fresh-cut wood stacked like future walls. They began with what they knew: cassava hills, a bed of corn, a raised patch where beans twined up poles. Miguel organized small teams of planting that learned the rhythms of the land through hands-on teaching. Perpetua taught the young women how to read seasons in the touch of soil, how to find plants for fever and poultices for wounds. They also brought with them knowledge that had been kept alive by necessity: weaving, dyeing, the care of infants, midwifery, and songs that remembered the river. Perpetua taught the women to prepare cloth in the old ways, how to scrape and spin, how to dye with annatto seeds to lend a red that sang on cotton, how to make indigo vats that were both practical and beautiful. They set up a small loom under an open shed and began producing textiles that were traded in the market for salt and sugar and the occasional tool. The work was humble but dignified. Hands that had once been controlled by others found agency in shaping threads into cloth. There were setbacks. The first rainy season brought a fever that took a child, and the community learned through grieving and trial how to tend one another. Herbal poultices and broth helped some. The elders taught the young ones how to steam a child's chest, how to read the rhythm of a breathing that might be recovering. There were disputes over boundaries and the old resentments that come when men and women begin to learn how to share resources. But the community learned governance in small increments. A council met under the shade of a large mango tree, to decide matters of planting rotation and school time. Children were given time to learn rather than to labor beyond their growth. Rosa's leadership was quiet and practical. She did not set herself above. She taught by example. She rose with the first bird and bent to the land, hands learning to plant cassava and to tell when the soil needed rest. Her voice in the council was measured and carried the memory of the square. She insisted on writing the history of who they were, starting with names and births and the marks on people's skin that had once been used to deny them. She worked with Padre Elias and the notary to see that what had been done in the square was recorded, and that children born in the new settlement would have identities that could not be taken. Clarice's transformation was not instantaneous, nor entirely pure. She did not become an angel at once. She stumbled, made requests for old comforts, and sometimes spoke with the old habit of entitlement. But she also learned to mend a net, to help with preparing a school desk, to apologize and to sit quietly when listened to. In time, she took on the role of tending the younger girls' teaching. She read scraps of print she had been allowed once in a tutor's hands, and now learned to teach others. Her eyes, once sharp with cruelty, softened into a shape that held remorse and the effort of repair. She and Rosa developed an uneasy friendship that was based on shared tasks and small, honest conversations about what had been done. Clarice learning to name the exact things she had been taught that had hurt others. Liberdade do Engenho grew by increments that made people hardy in character. The school began under the shade of a tree, with a scrap of slate, and a woman who knew letters teaching children to sound out words, starting with names. Names mattered. Each child learned to spell their own name before they learned to plant a row of beans. The community made sure the stories of their mothers and fathers were told aloud in the evenings, not as a litany of suffering, but as a record of survival. Perpetua's stories were performed like small plays, with children assigned parts to ensure the memory was not lost. Crafts formed a crucial part of survival. The women's loom produced cloth dyed with the bright red of anato and the deep blue of indigo. They stitched those fabrics into garments and sold them in the village market, trading them for salt, sugar, and sometimes a book. The men learned to draft simple notations so they could keep accounts of seed and harvest. Miguel, who had been the strong, steady backbone of many hard seasons, taught the patterns of crop rotation that kept the soil from fatigue. There were moments of external pressure. Not everyone in the nearby town applauded the new settlement. Those who had profited from the old arrangements fretted and muttered about lost labor. There were threats whispered in taverns, and once a small band of men came to the edge of the valley and made rude noises, testing the community's courage. The settlers responded in a manner that had less to do with grandeur than with practical intelligence. They sent a delegation with woven baskets of cassava bread and small bolts of cloth as an offer of trade. Economic interdependence turned potential hostility into commerce. Not all tensions evaporated, but the community's resilience lay in its capacity to create relations that made violence unnecessary. Seasons passed. Children who were toddlers in the earliest days of Liberdade grew into workers and storytellers. They learned to write with charcoal and to mark seeds with initials when they stored them for the next year. Rosa watched these children and felt that the crescent mark on her chest had become less a brand than a testimony. It was still a memory of an old injury, but it no longer defined the possibilities of the people who lived in the valley. Years made small alterations in everyone. The coronel, who had been a tower of old certainties, grew older and thinner in a way that papered humility onto his posture. He did not become a saint. He still had habits that grated on the edges of the world he had been asked to leave. But time and the moral ledger he had made public had a curious effect. He withdrew from the village's center of life and spent his days on the porch of the house, watching the distant valley, as if measuring what he had lost and what he had inadvertently given. There was a quiet rumor once that he had some property debts to clear, men who had extended loans to him under the assumption that his control of labor would continue, so he faced pressures that had nothing to do with conscience. Under the heavy weight of these things, and perhaps because he was aging into the shape of a man who had to look back, he took small steps toward closing the accounts in a manner that would allow the settlement to stand. It was not theatrical largesse, but a pragmatic parceling of land and tools in a way that allowed Liberdade do Engenho to consolidate. Whatever his motives, the action had consequence. The settlers gained further stability, and with it the capacity to plan long arcs like building a proper schoolhouse and planting a grove of fruit trees. Padre Elias grew old too. He would come to the settlement on certain Sundays to teach the children songs and to record births in a small book he kept in the shade. He did not preach veneer triumphalism. His sermons were short and stern and dedicated to the practical work of loving one's neighbor. His presence was not a substitution for law or for the hard work of building a community. It was a moral anchor, not an elixir. Perpetua, who for a long time had been the keeper of memory, began to slow. Her hips ached, and her steps became more careful, but her mind kept its stores of names and remedies. She taught a younger generation the pressing of leaves for poultices and the brewing of simple teas that soothed fevers. Children would come to her in the afternoons and sit at her knees as she sang old sewing songs and spoke of the crescent as a moon that remembered whole circles. Rosa married in a quiet ceremony to a man from the settlement some years after the Alforias, not for the sake of creating a household, but because their lives had braided into the same labor and care. The marriage was small, a few people beneath the same mango tree, and it was more of a covenant of support than a theatrical event. She kept her name. Together they worked on modest inventions in planting and storage that made small deposits of surplus for harder seasons. Her life was long and, in its slow unfolding, tender. Clarice took on the role of teacher, and she became particularly good at helping girls read and write. She took her own remorse and shaped it into a curriculum of humility, teaching that one's privilege does not disappear with apology, but must be transformed into action. Her hands were no longer used to command. They were used to mend cloth and to hold a child steady while the youngster learned a new letter. The community, over the years, established rituals that balanced work and memory. They had a remembrance day when Perpetua's stories and Benedita's name were spoken aloud, and a planting day when every family put a seed in the ground. They set rules against turning people into spectacle. Rosa insisted on a law of mutual respect written in the town ledger and read aloud each year by the children at the school. The crescent mark, once a sign of ownership, became a symbol of shared history. Some wore it in jewelry, others tattooed a little arc into the corner of their own hands as a sign of the story carried forward. When the coronel eventually died, it was without ceremony. He passed in the house where he had once been lord, in a bed softened by age and not by triumph. There was no mob and no leaping vengeance. The settlement learned of his death not through celebration, but as a note in the town's daily rhythm, a bell, a hush, a small reflection. People said that he had written a short note before he died, asking that his estate not be used to harm those he had freed. Whether the note came from true remorse or merely from a wish to close his affairs cleanly, it mattered less than the effect. Liberdade do Engenho continued with greater stability and fewer threats. Rosa visited the house once after his death. She did not go to triumph. She went to close a chapter. The house smelled of old papers and lavender. She stood in the room he had inhabited and remembered the man she had carried in the weight of a name. She felt neither hatred nor ease, so much as a settled understanding that the arc of a life had consequences that outlived almost every single heart. In time, the valley's schoolhouse was built of timber and whitewashed by hands that had learned painting as well as planting. The children raised letters on the wall and learned arithmetic used to measure seed bags and time. The women continued their indigo vats and their annatto dyes. They sold cloth in the market, and sometimes travelers came from other towns to buy the bright textiles and take home stories of a settlement that had emerged from the unlikeliest circumstances. Stories traveled as stories do, and they changed in the telling. Some added heroics that had not occurred, others flattened the edges and left only myth. Rosa, who was not interested in legend, preferred to teach the particular. She taught names and stitches and how to prepare cassava flour so it would store through the season. When children asked about the square where she had spoken her name, she told them the careful truth, that courage was not a quick thing, but the slow accrual of small acts of clarity, that naming something could open doors, but that behind each door there was work to do. In her later years she walked more carefully. Her hair turned silver in a way that made her look as if a moonlight had brushed each thread. Perpetua died one winter. her passing marked by the singing of the settlement and the planting of a memorial tree whose roots would, in a quiet way, learn the same rhythms as the people who planted it. People came together then with stew and song and the telling of old stories, not to worship the past, but to keep it alive like a lamp. Clarice's face grew lined with years of laughter and of hatreds dissolved into ash. She never regained the unearned entitlement of her youth. Instead, she found her place in the community's moral economy, part teacher, part contrition, part persistent servant of a good that had to be rebuilt daily. The two women, Rosa and Clarice, walked in each other's lives like people who had once been at odds and now shared a common labor, keeping memory honest and making sure the valley did not fall back into old patterns. In the last chapter of her life, Rosa would often sit on a low bench outside the schoolhouse and watch the children. They ran with scraps of cloth, their laughter weaving through the air like notes. She would place a hand on her chest and trace the crescent, and recall how once it had been used to keep her small. Now she felt it as a kind of map. The mark had been the beginning of her story in the square, but it had never been the end of what she could be. People asked her sometimes, when the sun made the bench warm, whether she felt vindicated. She would smile in a way that suggested something larger than satisfaction. "I was forced to carry the mistress like an animal," she would say, and the words were not spoken to sting but to remember. "They made me walk in the procession, but I carried more than a child on my back that day. I carried a truth that had weight enough to change people. I do not think of it as revenge." What followed was consequence, yes, but not of the sort you imagine. Clarice had to suffer a consequence, the loss of an easy life, the facing of what she had been taught, the admission of kinship. That is a painful thing, perhaps, but it brought about justice in a way that did not require more blood. We were given the possibility to build something that honored life. The phrase often drew a quiet from the listeners, one that was not merely the silence of attention, but the slow formation of an idea. That suffering does not make justice, that exposure, responsibility, and rebuilding do. Rosa's life had become a living testament to that proposition. She did not ask for hatred to be the engine of change, she asked for truth to be the axle. People in the settlement learned the difference and carried it forward in small acts, a refusal to make spectacle of suffering, a commitment to teach names, a rule that neighbors would always come together in times of illness. When Rosa finally died, it was in the plainness of things. She slept one night with the window open so the mango scent could find her, and in the morning she did not wake. People gathered in a circle that had no hierarchy, children with ribboned hair, men with calluses, women with hands stained indigo, because the community she had helped build was a map of relationships rather than ranks. They sang the songs Ignazia had hummed by the river, the same songs that had been taught to children until they became, for all practical purposes, the settlement's heartbeat. After the burial, people walked back to their work. The schoolhouse bell rang for class. The indigo vat steamed as one woman lifted a cloth to check its color. Perpetua's tree stood with new green, and the crescent mark on Rosa's chest became, in stories and in the soft language of the valley, a symbol both personal and communal, a reminder of the costs of silence and the labor of naming. Years later, children who had been little runners in the first seasons of Liberdade would retell the story in their own way. Some would focus on Rosa's courage in speaking her name. Others would dwell on the coronel's public confession and the notary's ink. A few would linger on Clarice's learning curve, how a child of privilege had come to sit at the same table and learn to darn socks. The tale evolved and spread, sometimes sharpening into legend, sometimes flattening into fact. People in other towns who came to buy cloth and cassava asked the storyteller whether revenge had ever been served. The answer, when given by those who had lived it, was always the same. Consequences were served, but not in kind. They were served through accountability and reparation, through the painstaking work of building a life that honored those who had been silenced. On quiet evenings, when the valley settled into the hush that comes after the day's work is done, someone would look toward the house on the hill and think of the square beneath the noon sun. They would recall the day when a woman refused to be property and used the shape of a crescent to point to a larger truth. That memory served as a quiet liturgy. Speak names, hold witnesses, build anew. If this story is speaking to you, stay with us and subscribe to hear more voices carved from history. The settlement endured because people told true stories about themselves and acted on them. The mark that had once been used to measure ownership had become, slowly and stubbornly, a sign of survival and of an insistence upon personhood. The mistress had suffered consequences, not bloodied revenge but the loss of unearned privilege and the exposure of a lie that had supported an entire social arrangement. In losing that comfort, Clarice gained another kind of education, the painful daily work of mending what had been torn. Liberdade do Engenho stood for many years as a place of work and of teaching. Its children learned letters and stitches, its elders taught herbs and songs, and its women wove cloth that carried patterns remembering the river and the moon. The valley taught its own long lesson, that dignity is not granted by spectacle, but grown by hands that plant, water, teach, and forgive. When people speak of Rosa now, they do not reduce her to a single protest in a square. They remember the long arc. They remember Perpetua stooping with the cracked mug, Miguel steady at her elbow, Padre Elias writing the papers, Clarice kneeling and learning. They remember a small moon under a collarbone and how it became a map. The story's end is not a tidy triumph. It is instead a practice of continued repair, telling names, tending seedlings, teaching children that their names belong to them. If this account moved you, share it with someone who values truth and memory, and subscribe for more stories that listen to the past and let it teach the present.